All right, good evening, everybody. This is Alpha Ministries in Recovery and Grace, and we're going to cover the third step tonight. We made a decision to turn our lives, our will and our lives to the care of God as we understood Him. This is a tricky step for me because naturally we are used to running our own lives and turning your care and your will, turning your will and your lives over, to God's care as we understand God. It's a little tricky because in the crossover to Christianity and living by the scriptures, we often pray to know God's will and to do God's will, and there's that struggle that we have between the flesh and the spirit, and turning our lives over to the care of God. Because the flesh has a mind of its own, its agenda of its own, it wants to do its own thing. We're conditioned, especially in our culture, that we have so much freedom to do what we want on any given day. Quite often, I know in my own life that I'm a little bit flippant, but there's part of me that trusts that God's going to get me where He wants me to be, in spite of that, in spite of me. But what I found is that after running your own life and running your own show, and it becomes unmanageable, you want that. You want the leadership of the Holy Spirit. Pam, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I was scrambling for some notes.
Okay.
I told John I could do this standing on my head, but I didn't think he'd take me seriously.
Yeah, see, there you go.
Teach me to brag, huh? Probably not.
Explain to him what we're doing.
Yeah. So Pam, you want to give us a little overview of step 3? And then we'll have a little discussion.
When I think about step 3, number 1, the first thing I tell people is don't do it. Do what I did. Don't do what I did. When I read step 3 in my perfectionistic brain, I read it as saying something like, I turned the will and the care of my life over to God, doing His perfect will on a moment by moment basis from that day forward. And that interpretation in my perfectionistic brain of what I thought the third step meant gave me a ton of problems. I would go to my sponsor regularly saying something like, oh, I blew my third step. I blew my third step. And she would go, what do you mean you blew your third step? Did you change your mind? Have you decided that you want the will and the care of your life back? And I'm like, oh, no, I don't want that. And she said, well, then you didn't blow your third step. What do you mean you didn't do it perfectly? And I'm like, well, okay, I guess. And getting it through my head that step 3 was absolutely nothing except a decision. It was a decision that I made. I personally didn't have a lot of trouble with making that decision because I didn't get to this place in my life until I was done. I was done. I tell people all the time, if you've got one more rabbit up your sleeve, if you've got one more good idea of how you're going to make this all work out, you're probably not going to do this step. You're not going to make this. It is too hard. But when you are done, when you have truly admitted powerlessness, unmanageability, and a belief that there is a power, even if I had no clue what it was. The only reason I believed in it was because I was set in a room full of other people who told stories, some of them were worse than mine, and claimed that this power had changed their lives. And I'm like, okay, fine, go for it. And so but a lot of people don't come to that place. The whole concept of making a decision to turn the world and the care of their life over is really complicated, and I understand that. I've worked with people come from all different backgrounds and spectrums, but the one thing that helped me a lot was to recognize that this was just a decision, that I did not have to do it perfectly. The next thing that I think about when I think about step 3 is I go to the end of this step and emphasize that because we have a English language with a Latin base, we have a masculine him as God, and that God is not male. That the idea of gender is a concept of hormones and genitalia. And most people who believe in a Judeo-Christian God do not believe of a God with hormones and genitals. So we're not talking about a male God. When it says, as we understood him, as I understood him, I always emphasize what John taught me. And that is the only way we can have a personal relationship with God is with the God of our understanding. If it is somebody else's understanding, it is not a personal relationship. So whatever that understanding is, one of the reasons I love the 12-step program so much is that it did not require me to even accept a religious God. It just had to be something greater than myself. I also fall back on what John says when people want to talk about using their home group as their higher power. And I'm like, you obviously have never been to a business meeting for your home group. You won't use them for very long. It's sort of like being in leadership in the church. If you don't have a real strong faith, you don't want to get in leadership in your church. Well, you don't want to go to a business meeting for your home group if your home group is your higher power. When I think about the will and the care of my life, the way I think about that is when I turn my will over, I go back to the little chart with a mind, will, and emotions. And that chart tells me that my will is where I make a decision. So I interpret that as being, I start turning my decisions over to God. When I turn my will, again, I had been one of the most strong-willed people I've ever met, for better or worse. I really struggled with that a lot. And my sponsor said, whose else's will are you going to go with? It's going to be yours or somebody else's or God's. And I had tried all of these to the point that I was done. I made my decision. And to say that I did not know what God wanted me to do. I didn't know anything about hearing God at that point in my life. And I didn't know any way to go about doing it. And my sponsor said, well, do you have a pretty fair idea of what God doesn't want you to do? She said, do you think God's will probably includes lying, cheating, conning, stealing, manipulating, holding grudges? I said, no. She said, well, eliminate all of the options that you can think of that involve something you're pretty sure God doesn't want you to do. And if you've got more than one option left, just pick one. He'll cover you. And I said, oh, okay, I can do that. So when I turn my will over, I turn my choices over. When I turn the care of my life over, I interpret that as being the consequences for my choices. I turn my choices over and the consequences for those choices over to the God of my understanding. For that love to manage and take care of my life. That is the decision that I'm making. My favorite thing, and this, I'll close with this, came in the big book. I was listening to a Joe and Charlie tape one time. I'd been sober years. I'd done all my steps. And I was listening to a Joe and Charlie tape, and they said something about in the big book, it said, though our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once it was followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which were blocking us. I nearly wrecked my car. I'd sat in meetings for years where I had heard people say, don't rush your fourth step. Don't rush your fourth step. Don't rush your fourth step. You might get drunk if you rush your fourth step. And there Joe and Charlie were quoting out of the big book. I had to go home and look it up, and I'll be darned if that wasn't there. It's exactly what it says. It says that your third step could being a power word, could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort. My interpretation on that is if there's a step I'm going to delay, it's maybe my third step. But when I think about that, I think, well, if I'm going to delay my third step, maybe I need to delay my second step. And if I'm going to delay my second step, maybe it's my first step. So I come down to the bottom line of being the one step you don't want to rush is step one. But once you've done that, you have decided, then all the rest of the steps are a natural progression that should come right along. Thanks.
Amen. John, we were having some technical difficulty. Let's check you out, see if you're.
I don't know if you can hear me now, Bill, but
You're better.
I appreciate very much what Pam had to say about her experience with the third step and the third step itself. You know, one of the things I wanted out on this study of the third step is that it's really what theologians, actually the first three steps, theologians would call a conversion, what Jesus described as being in the personal encounter with God constitutes the basis of spiritual awakening. Everyone's talking about recovery. It's a step to the book, and it actually summarizes the first three steps. So it's possible to actually make a decision to turn your will and your life over to anybody, much less understanding, as you yourself understanding that you're powerless and your life is unmanageable. Like Pam said it, you know, end of your rope, and there's no other alternative for you. And likewise, possible to turn that will and your life over to God as you understand Him, unless you believe there is a God. And I was listening to that actually turned me on to last night, a discussion of the third step, and he was struggling, and I suspect a lot of people struggle in the same way. When it came to the third step, it was hard for him because he, you know, and so your will and life over to somebody you don't believe in, and so that was difficult. He recounted a story running into an old timer meeting, The old timer had been sober for many years, and told him, he confided in him and said, "Man, I'm really having trouble with this third step here. You know, I don't believe in God." And the old timer said, "Oh, that's a piece of cake." He says, "You see that chair there? Well, in your life over the chair of that chair. Do it right now." You know, okay. Turn my will and my life over to the and that a miracle would happen as soon as he did that. The guy said, "Where's the miracle?" "Here's the miracle. Idiot that's been running your life up to this point." And so when you come to the fact that your life is unmanageable and that you've been the one running it all along, there's nobody else to blame, then it's easier to turn your decisions, turn your will and your life to the care of God as you understand it. I like the fact that you put in there as you understand Him, because I don't know anybody, I haven't read anybody, I haven't heard of anybody that really understands God. By definition, He's unknowable. It's impossible for us to really understand Him in the way we think of the word understanding. So we're going to get a limited understanding, which they say is our understanding. I haven't read anybody. I haven't heard of anybody really understand. Are you losing me, Bo?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of get a reverb kind of effect. I don't know why. Only one here.
Yeah.
The point is, on the third step, that understanding God doesn't mean you have a theological knowledge of the 7 divisions of systematic theology. All it means is your understanding. If that understanding is hardly anything at all, that's good enough. It doesn't require any knowledge or understanding. I'll be learning from now on. Yeah. So I'm hoping that this message is coming through. In case it's not, I want to break a little bit into David, join us tonight. That's David, his take on the third step, and David to share the suggested prayer of the third step, just to give us the idea of what that would look like to actually turn your will toward God as you understand it. David?
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. I didn't quite understand what you said, but so my experience with the third step kind of goes back to what Pam was saying. Starts off with the first step, that I'm powerless. My life's unmanageable. It was all I have to do is look at my life and what alcohol took me, the unmanageability of it, even staying sober for lengths of time, not being able managing my life was, I'd manage it into some other mess, some other problem, some other issue, not getting along with people, just a mess. And so step 1 brought me to step 2, came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. The first sanity was the sanity of picking up a drink again. So now I'm in this situation where I'm powerless, life's unmanageable, and I'm coming to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And through prayer and asking God to help me to stay sober, asking Him to help me walk through life, and then seeing Him do things created a faith in me that I started to come to believe that a power greater than myself could do something to change my life. And then going on to step 3, which kind of moves you right into step 3, make a decision. And it is a decision. And that decision for me, because of my alcoholic brain, I'm attempt to make that decision on a daily basis. And when I get up in the morning and having said that, there's a prayer in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called our third step prayer. And I've memorized that for my own personal reasons. And it goes, kind of like this. It says, God, I offer myself to thee to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them would bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. This is just something for me, it's a daily decision, because when I run my life, I run it into the ground. And every morning when I get up, I have a choice to make. Am I going to run it today, or am I going to allow him to run it? And even throughout the day, I can use the serenity prayer to help keep me on track. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So my experiences through prayer and watching him do things, as I've learned the Alpha series, the first thing I noticed was meeting my personal needs, having a job, a place to live. I mean, from where I came from in alcohol and drug addiction, I had none of these things. So I had to watch him create this stuff in my life, my physical needs, and then personal needs, that I had worth. And that adding to the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's just made amazing differences in my life. So came to believe, and making a decision to turn my will and my life over to care of God is something that's important to me, very important, because without that, I'll go right back to where I came from, the vomit that I came out of. I've seen it happen to me before. And so for me, it's a daily thing. So thank you.
David, one of the points you made, if you guys can hear me, I don't know if you can hear me, but one of the points you made was this is a daily thing. The third step, like all the other steps, is to happen daily. It's not just a one-shot deal. It's a process, and the more we learn, the better the process becomes noticeable and visible to us. If you turn your will and life over to the care of God, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket, it's going to be rough on you. If you watch him put it together, then you learn. You learn that he, in fact, does for you what you can't do for yourself. The other point, maybe you could comment on this, is really step 3 is the death of selfishness and self-centeredness. It goes to the very core of self-centered nature. Not my will, but yours be done. What do you have on that, Tom?
Yeah. First of all, I'll echo what Pam and David both said, and that, and John reaffirmed, is that, when we turn our life and our will over to God as we understand him, that's a daily thing. And we don't, the expectation is not that we get that perfect on the first try. The reality is that is our motivation. But the performance of that is really up to the power of God through the Holy Spirit working out through grace, a real transformation in us. And the reality is also that we are going to take our will back on a day-to-day basis and constantly have to challenge that thought in our mind. As far as, are we going to be willfully guided by him, or are we going to continue to run our own show? So one other thing I'll add in there before I get to John's question is that any power greater than ourselves is a higher power. I mean, so the fatal mistake that I've seen a lot of people make, including myself, is that we tend to choose a higher power other than God because it is powerful and there are certain advantages of submitting to a higher power. For example, a power of a spouse or a relationship with someone. So that's something that we need to really consider. And I finally came to the realization that if I was going to give up control, I was going to seek out the best. And that's where I came to God as I understand him. And what I came to discover was that I didn't understand nearly as much as I thought I did, even though I had a lot of experience. I had been churched. And the problem is my understanding was clouded by the traditions of men. We talked about that, Bill and I, a couple of weeks ago in the Alpha series, that the traditions of men often become a stumbling block to us. And when I'm talking about the traditions of men, I'm mostly talking about religion, but there are other traditions that are a stumbling block as well. So, I had to be open for God to show up and give me that personal understanding of him, on his time schedule as well. I might add that he does that on his time schedule. So, and finally getting to the selfishness issue is that, the epitome of selfishness is really saying that I'm in control of my life. Thank you very much. God, I'll call you if I need you. But for now, I'm running things. And if we get back to our, again, what we learned in the Alpha series, and if you missed out those lessons, never fear, we're gonna come around again with them. But our flow chart regarding the Solomon syndrome, when we talked about if we have an unmet need, we have a deficit motivation, and we think we can identify whatever that need is that's going to make us okay, that becomes like a life and death situation. Oh, there it is right there. So, we have a deficit motivation that leads us to a false assumption that I will be worthy if. So we take off in a pursuit of those false goals. And think of that, if we equate that to hunger and thirst on the physical side of our needs, we also have a hunger for security and a thirst for significance personally. And it's life or death, just like physical hunger and thirst. So if something gets in the way of that, I'm going to break really selfish. And if you or anyone else gets in the way, it's just too bad. You're going to be a casualty. And that leads to us trampling over other people and, hurting them. And then that cycle of hate just gets spiraling out of control. And to the point that we just can't take it anymore, and we've got to take an edge off somehow. So, Bill, I'll kick it back to you. Thank you very much for being so timely with that chart.
No problem. Well, the thing that trips me up the most with step 3 is that I would call it routine. I have a job. Exercise is important, so I have my day planned out the day before. Sometimes I have my week planned out, and but what helps me in understanding is the motivation of love, the motivation to love and to be loved. And God showed me that sometimes if I'm swimming, let's say, that he showed me that that's kind of his time sometimes to minister to me, to kind of speak to me, and to be on the bottom of the hierarchy, dealing with my health. Then I have to go to work, and then I have to bring home the paycheck and all that. So when you think of turning things over to God, I can go on cruise control for quite some time and be back to running my own life. But what I found is when those obstacles come and those things come, instead of with a bulldog tenacity sticking to my routine, really asking, what the big picture is, what other people involved, and how do I love everybody involved in any given situation. So I think being motivated by love, faith, hope, and love is a picture maybe or a snapshot or compatible with the third step. Is that like John was talking about breaking through self-centeredness, and it's really seeing the big picture and seeing that, as people say, it's not all about you, and to really um, seek God of how to love other people, how to love others, is a way for me to turn my life um, and will over to the care of God, as I understand God is love. That if I'm asking, how do I love other people, um, and really, if something comes up that breaks into my routine, seek that's what God wants, to see if that's what He wants, and not to be OCD or think that I have to stick to my routine. So that there's a lot involved, and we're like I said, that cruise control part kind of trips me up sometimes. That I mistakenly sometimes think, well, I'm back to running my own life now. So I have to. I think everything is balanced with loving other people, seeing the big pictures, knowing that like I think Pam talked about, you're accepting the consequences of your choices. That's something that I needed to hear tonight. That because a lot of times when there's bad consequences, we want to figure out how the hell am I going to get out of this? How am I going to save myself? But we're turning that over to God. He's in charge of all of that. So that's Pam shaking her head. Yeah. John, you got anything on that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of, a little bit. All right, you guys, read my lips. Step 3 is the death of selfishness. Selfishness, self-centeredness, believe, is the root of all our problems. It says that about step 3. And for that reason, we got to get rid of our will. We've got to turn our will over to the care of God, along with our life, because our will is to save our life, right? Everything I want, meant to save my own skin. It's meant to make me look good. It's meant to make me in charge. It's meant to look like I'm on top of things. The problem is that when I'm running the show, bad show. It never turns out like I want to. I love the way the big book describes it in the third step about us being an actor, on the show. We want to set the stage. We want to tell the other players in the play what they ought to be doing. We want to control the lighting. We want to control everything about that show. And of course, we've got the best intentions, but for the good of all. Say, but the problem is we're not capable of doing that. We're not capable of running the show. Only God is capable of that. So when we turn our will over to the care of God, then we're giving up our self-centered desire to run the universe. I shared it when we were talking about step 1, that I read this little saying on one of my day timers. It said, for peace of mind, design is the general manager of the universe. You can't run your own life. I was talking to a fellow the other day who has trouble because he's a paraplegic with bowel movements. And of course, I don't want to get gross here on this. The point is, we can't even control our own bowels. So the idea that we're in charge, that we can decide what's best for ourselves and other people and make it happen if we just hang in there, we just push hard enough. Really, the insanity that we had to from. This, I'll make this point. This is not just for alcoholics or addicts. We're talking humanity here. We're talking across the board human nature. Yes, it's reflected in the terrible disease of alcoholism. Yes, it's reflected in the stories that Alex will tell in the house. Not limited by any means to alcoholics or addicts or people with substance use disorders. It is across the board part and parcel of human nature. That's why I insist that we are all in recovery. And no matter what our decision, every one of us need to resign as a manager of the universe. Everyone needs to make that decision in our life over the care of God as we understand it. It's the only healthy, functional way to live. Good. Right back to you now for further comments. You got any comments on third step from what we've been discussing tonight?
You asked Pam?
John said triggered for me was the idea that I resigned as general manager of the universe. I used to have a lot of sayings that I thought were really cute. And one of them was, if it don't work, get a bigger hammer. And that was sort of my philosophy of life. And I would just push and push and push. And when it all fell apart, I would blame everybody else. So, probably one of the most frequent examples of the third step in my life is that I take a step, and if it doesn't work, I stand still. I was talking to my sponsor this morning. It's an Al-Anon saying, but it works for everybody. And that is, don't just do something, sit there. And I used to have that taped on my computer monitor at work, because if I would do something. And it was like, no, don't. Just sit there. Wait. See if God's got a better idea, if there's a different plan. And that was just a tremendous functioning of doing a third step in my life. Thank you.
Good. Dave, you got anything to add to that?
I think everybody's covered it very well as far as, making a decision to turn our will and our lives over to care of God. The only thing I can add is what that looks like when we do that, and what we see happen, what I experience happens during the day when I'm really able to let go of the control and let him run the show and watch just incredible things happen. Things work out where there was a problem, where I thought there was a problem, turned out not to be a problem. What was a problem turned into some kind of a different solution than what I had in mind, and which continuously teaches me that that I'm not a good director and good leader for my own life. And being able to stay out of that position is a daily challenge. Some days it's easier than others. But I mean, the fruit of turning my will and my life over to care of God is second to none as far as what happens. So that's the acts of doing it. I think we've all kind of discussed it in pretty good depth. Pam had a lot to offer. Everybody did, but the fruit of doing it is pretty neat. Now, it does, as Pam said, the book says immediately we need to go into a fourth step. That's to get rid of the garbage inside of us that keeps us blocked. And as I've heard and been around the room, the same thing I've heard Pam say tonight is that it's not emphasized correctly around most meetings, but the book says immediately. It doesn't say wait 6 months or practice step 3 for 4 months. It doesn't say that. It says immediately go into step 4, which is, that step is which we're about to enter into next week. I guess step 4 is, there's a lot of controversy as to how to do a step 4, and which will be an interesting group next week. But I guess there's a lot of ways that people talk about doing it and how to do it. But again, you go back to the book and how it says is what I've learned. But so I think that for me, step 3 it's exciting to be able to do that, to have somebody run my life that truly cares about my well-being. And the more I practice it, the more I realize it. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, a question came to mind, and maybe I'll bounce this off of Pam and John, is would step 4 be, going into step 4 be a practical example of turning our will and our lives over the care of God as we understand God? Like doing the next step, would that be a good example of that?
There's actual literature that says that you really have not done a step 3 unless you move on to your 4th step.
Mm-hmm.
It is that, I closed my book, but it's that action. And at some point it even quotes James, where it says faith without works is dead. So if you say, I've done my 3rd step, but there's no works behind it, really, aren't you still running your own life if you're not doing the next thing you're being told to do?
Yeah.
I think there's also the idea that doing the 4th step is a natural outcome of the 3rd step.
Yeah.
At the end of this week, I'm looking forward to it. I hope we resolve some of these people issues by then. But I'm looking forward to doing step is to really understand the 3rd. And as you said, they don't kind of go together. But an argument can be made for all steps, all right, because they're under the program of recovery. But as we get into the 4th step, we're going to be looking at the reality of the 3rd step, that what I mentioned earlier as the conversion process, the reality of that naturally in our lives, especially in light of dealing the death blow to that selfishness we were born with. So we'll talk about that later.
All right. I don't know. There was a lot of issues tonight, Tom. We could hear Tom's voice perfectly, but he was froze for a while. John's busting up. Maybe it's the weather. It's been pouring here. I don't know what it's like out there in Okeechobee, John. But we'll get those things ironed out. And wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Have some of the people there with us. Marcia and Dan, Michael, Wendy, Forrest here, Denny. Then some of the people were mentioning that John was cutting in and out. All right. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. And say good night to everybody. Thank everybody for tuning in. And
Thank you.
Next week, step 4, this Thursday, Tom and I will be doing relational empowerment, and we'll be covering that. We're still talking about personal skills, spiritual enlightenment, and cognitive reconstruction, changing our mind. And it's a good word that all of this is on a daily basis. Jesus is our bread of life, and we ate food yesterday. It doesn't mean we're not going to eat tomorrow, right? So it's still that dependence is always there, 24/7. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and bearing with us. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye, you guys.
Thank you all.